A dozen federal judges just issued a chilling warning. Unless the Supreme Court changes course, somebody is going to die. Right, and that is Trump is asking the Supreme Court to overturn last week's 7-4 appeals court ruling that determined he does not, in fact, have the authority to implement most of the tariffs that he's placed on foreign imports recently. Though the appeals court did give Trump some wiggle room to ask the Supreme Court to weigh in on the matter before the ruling takes effect, which is exactly what he's doing, with both Trump and his Justice Department framing the appeals court ruling as catastrophic for the country. And you've got Solicitor General John Sauer saying in a written filing to the High Court, the stakes in this case could not be higher. The president and his cabinet officials have determined that the tariffs are promoting peace and unprecedented economic prosperity, and that the denial of tariff authority would expose our nation to trade retaliation without effective defenses and thrust America back to the brink of economic catastrophe. With Trump then asking the Supreme Court to expedite their ruling because, quote, the financial fabric of our country is at stake. And specifically, he's requesting they take up the case by September 10th and then hear arguments in November, which really would be especially fast considering that the High Court's new term doesn't even begin until October 6th. And so now that's a ruling we're definitely going to have to keep an eye out for, but we should also zoom out a bit and talk about how this is, it's really just another example of Trump using emergency rulings from the Supreme Court to essentially rubber stamp his agenda. And I mean, you've got lower court judges saying that by allowing Trump to do so, the Supreme Court is potentially undermining the entire judiciary system. And in fact, in an incredibly rare interview, you had a dozen federal judges, notably both Republican and Democratic appointees, sitting down with NBC, and all 12 spoke on the condition of anonymity out of concern about retaliation and threats, which of course has become a very real problem in recent years. But these judges, they all pointed to a pattern that's been emerging. They're handed a contentious case relating to the Trump administration. They painstakingly research the law to reach their rulings, and when they rule against Trump, they have to deal with the intense criticism and harsh words. And then the case is appealed to the Supreme Court, where an emergency ruling rejects the lower court judge's findings with little to no explanation. And so all of that leading to lower courts looking shoddy and biased against Trump, which opens them up to a whole new level of criticism from big names in the MAGA world, and even occasionally Trump himself. Hell, at one point, Trump even threatened the job of a judge who ruled against him in a high-profile immigration case. And you had one of the judges saying that the Supreme Court is essentially helping the Trump administration undermine the lower courts, and they're throwing judges under the bus. With another adding, it is inexcusable, they don't have our backs, and that judge also saying that major reform must happen or, quote, somebody is going to die. Right? One of the big changes that they're calling for here is for Chief Justice John Roberts to step up and do more to protect them. Or with 4 of the judges saying that Roberts as Chief Justice could push back against Team Trump's hostilities against lower courts if and when they rule against Trump's agenda. And while it's been noted that, there have been a couple of times that Roberts has verbally defended the judiciary, you had the judges arguing it's the actions that really matter. Saying that the Supreme Court's unexplained rulings in Trump's favor, they say more than any statement, right? Words are words and actions are actions. And all of this is, an important note here is that, it's not just about the Supreme Court leaning right in their rulings, right? The Supreme Court, it's leaned one direction or the other at several points in US history. It is more about the role of emergency cases, right? I mean, emergency rulings, they're not a new thing. Back in 2015, a University of Chicago law school professor coined the term shadow docket for cases that are fast-tracked around the usual months-long appeal process. And before Trump, this was usually for things like death row inmates' attempts to block their execution at the 11th hour. But Trump has taken the shadow docket to explode with hot-button nationwide dispute cases, starting back in his first administration with his travel ban on people entering the United States from mostly Muslim-majority countries, which the Supreme Court at the time allowed to partially go into effect. And in his second time around, he's already asked the Supreme Court to block lower court rulings on an emergency basis 23 times. Right? And the Supreme Court has agreed 17 times, and of the remaining cases, they've only said no twice. The one is still pending, and the other 3 being resolved without decisions. And for comparison, it appears that throughout the entire 4-year Biden administration, they filed applications for emergency rulings only 19 times. And even with that, the court only gave the thumbs up 10 times. But going back to Trump, of the 17 cases that the Supreme Court okayed for his administration just this year, 5 of those reportedly offered no explanation for their ruling, and 7 of them reportedly had less than 3 pages of reasoning. Though that's also not a complaint exclusive to Trump. I mean, of the 10 wins the Supreme Court gave the Biden administration, 8 of those had no explanation. And that ends up being a problem because, as one of the 10 judges explained to NBC, the Supreme Court has a responsibility to explain their rulings in a way that the public can understand. And the lack of those explanations, it's resulted in serious problems for lower court judges who are required to follow the Supreme Court's lead. But then because of the lack of explanation, they're not sure what they're supposed to do or how to proceed in the related cases, especially in cases where the Supreme Court undermines established precedent without overturning it entirely. Right? And there's also the unspoken message that the Supreme Court's sending by churning out emergency rulings in favor of Trump's agenda, with one of the judges telling NBC that the Supreme Court is effectively endorsing Team Trump's stance that the lower courts are biased against them, and adding, it's almost like the Supreme Court is saying it is a judicial coup. And so ultimately, that's where we are. We have this growing concern, and it remains to be seen, is this just going to continue? Is Roberts going to do anything different? We'll have to wait and see.